Hello again and welcome back to the second stage of our Introduction to Shares course. This point in time we are going to be now focusing on a stock exchange, on a stock market, and we're going to have a look at the actual process that you would have to go through in order to buy a batch of shares. We're also going to look at how to interpret the price page in the newspaper so that you become very familiar with the environment in which you're going to get involved in as a share investor. In South Africa, the stock exchange, as we said, is, as it is anywhere in the world, a place where buyers and sellers of shares would go in order to effect that transaction. Now, once upon a time, if one goes back into the history of this country, there were stock exchanges all over the country, including places like Kimberley. In fact, a lot of those stock exchanges were set up around the mining activity of the day. And in those days, it was very common for a person who wanted to buy or to sell shares to go directly to that market, to that place, and to find someone, or to look for someone who wanted to sell the shares that they wanted to buy, or alternatively to buy the shares that they wanted to sell. But of course, eventually this became impractical because some days the market was just too busy. There were too many people shouting and screaming, trying to attract the attention of other people who they would sell their shares to or buy their shares from. So there came a time where the stock market was localized, centralized in Johannesburg, in Diagonal Street, and from that time, the members of the public who wanted to buy and sell shares could no longer go there themselves, but rather they would appoint a stockbroker to serve as their agent and to buy or sell the shares on their behalf. Now, during that phase, the market was based upon a system called open outcry. And if you were to have bought shares during that period of the stock exchange history, which lasted right through to the middle of the 1990s, then it would have worked something like this. Let's assume that Joe is a potential investor. For the first time, he's coming onto the markets and he would like to buy some shares. And he's done some analysis and he's discovered that he would like to buy some De Beers shares because he believes that they will pay a reasonably good dividend. First case, and in the second case he believes that if he holds on to them for a long period of time, he will make a capital gain. So Joe would want to buy 100 De Beers. Why 100? Well, because the stock market prefers investors to buy in multiples of 100 or to sell in multiples of 100. That is called a round lot. So Joe wants to buy 100 De Beers shares. So he phones up the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, he phones and asks to speak to the Public Relations Department, and they will put him in touch with a stockbroker. They will give him a telephone number of a couple of stockbrokers. Joe will then make a call through to one of the stockbrokers, whose names he was given, and he will ask that stockbroker to act on his behalf and to buy 100 De Beers shares. Now, Joe may instruct the stockbroker to buy them at best, or otherwise known as market, meaning that the stockbroker should acquire the shares at the best possible price that he or she can get them at. Or, Joe may specify that the stockbroker is to buy them, but to pay no more than 10 Rand per share, for argument's sake. Now, remember what we said earlier is that share prices are quoted in cents, not in rands, so the transaction then would be stated at 1,000 cents, which is the equivalent of 10 Rand. Now, the stockbroker would phone down to what was called the trading floor. Now, the trading floor was effectively a space where the market operated, where shares were physically bought and sold. And on that trading floor, there were people called dealers. And their job was to act as an agent on behalf of Joe and to try and find a seller of De Beers shares that Joe would therefore be able to get his 100 De Beers shares from. So here is the dealer who works for the same brokerage, and that person's job is to go up to the big board, and in that board is all the shares that are listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, including De Beers, is written there, and this person would go and stand underneath that board and shout out the name of the share, De Beers, De Beers, De Beers, 3 times in loudest possible voice. At that point in time, a waiter would come dashing across the floor with a tray full of beers. That's a joke. That's a joke. At that point in time, he would have hoped to attract the attention of another dealer on the stock market floor who would have a client wanting to sell De Beers shares. Now, assuming that nobody responds to that call, the dealer would instruct a scribe or a recorder to enter into the B column, which stands for buy, 1,000 cents. Meaning that there is a buyer out there, in other words, Joe, our friend Joe, and that buyer is prepared to pay 10 Rand or 1,000 cents for De Beers shares. Now that information is put into the newspaper at the end of the day, and anybody buying that newspaper can see that if they want to sell their De Beers at 10 Rand, that there's a buyer who's ready available and is prepared to pay that amount. So do you see that the market, the secondary market, is publicized, and everybody can know what the price of shares are simply by purchasing a newspaper or even turning on a television or buying a financial journal. So the buying price of 10 Rand stands as tribute to Joe's purchasing. Let's assume that on the other end of town, Sue, who is a holder of De Beers shares, she currently has these shares, she feels that it's time for her to sell. Now this is what makes a market, is two people with opposite opinions. Joe feels that it's the right time to buy De Beers shares, and he feels that he can do well out of that decision. Sue, on the other hand, has held her De Beers shares for some time, and she considers this is a good time to be selling those shares. Two opposite opinions make the market. One buyer, one seller, each with opposite viewpoints. Sue has phoned up her stockbroker and has instructed that broker to sell the De Beers shares that she holds, but she's only prepared to sell them for 10 Rand and 20 cents. 1,020 cents. Her stockbroker will then contact the dealer representing their firm on the floor, and that dealer will also go and position him or herself underneath the De Beers shares and shout out that there is a trader for that share. If there's no response, Sue's sell order for 1020 will then be recorded into the S column, into the sell column, which shows everybody that there is a seller who's prepared to part with their shares for 10 Rand and 20 cents. Now, as you can see, no deal will take place. The shares will not be transferred from Sue to Joe, simply because Sue wants more than Joe is prepared to pay. So one of three things must now happen. Firstly, Joe may see that there's a seller for 1020 and may up his price to 1020, and the deal will go through. Sue, seeing that she's not getting her price, may be prepared to drop by 20 cents and sell to Joe at 10 Rand. Or, thirdly, another person may come into the market who is prepared to pay more than Joe's 10 Rand, or who is prepared to sell for less than Sue's 10 Rand 20. And this is what makes the market active, in that anybody who's prepared to pay more than Joe or prepared to sell for less than Sue will take preference. So if Harry is prepared to pay 10 Rand 10 cents, Harry's buy order will replace Joe's 10 Rand because he's prepared to offer more. So the market works on a price priority. The highest bidder and the lowest seller takes priority. Now, let's assume that under these circumstances, Joe is worried about the share getting away from him. He feels that De Beers is a really good opportunity, and he's quite happy to pay the extra 20 cents. He contacts his broker, and he says to his broker, up my price from 10 to 10.20. On that basis, the deal now takes place. Joe will buy Sue's shares. The buy and the sell column will now be cleared out. And into the column next door, which is headed L, standing for the last transaction, into that column will go the 10 Rand 20 cents at which that deal took place. So that amount, the last amount, is the most recent price that investors have attached to De Beers shares. That's what they think most recently that share is worth. And if the company's prospects are looking better, and tomorrow in the newspaper there's a report about how De Beers is expanding and growing and its markets are getting bigger and bigger, then we will imagine that there will be a lot more buyers coming onto the market wanting De Beers shares, and therefore the price will be pushed up. So what's happening is that the price of a share is not being determined by the government, nor is it determined by the stock market. The price of a share is purely determined by how many people want to buy it and what price they're prepared to pay versus how many are prepared to sell that share. And if there are more buyers than sellers, that will push the prices up. And if there are more sellers than buyers, that will push the price down. So the price of stocks or shares on the Johannesburg Exchange are based on the simple principle of supply and demand. Therefore, in conclusion, we might say, Joe wanted to buy 100 De Beers shares. If Sue wanted to sell 100 De Beers shares, well, then that's a perfect match. But it's unlikely that it'll always be a perfect match. Sue maybe wanted to sell 500 shares. What would then happen is that Sue would sell the first 100 of that 500 to Joe, and thereafter the other 400 shares would still be available, and she would remain a seller at 10 Rand 20, and the 10.20 would remain in the sell column. But as it stands at the moment, the market is waiting for new buyers and new sellers to place orders to buy and sell De Beers shares on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Now, this system that we've been describing was called open outcry because of the way in which the dealers would position themselves, call out the shares, attract attention to the fact that there's a buyer or a seller for that share. However, if you were to visit the Johannesburg Stock Exchange today and ask to go to the trading floor, you would be bitterly disappointed because this entire way of the market trading or operating is no longer.